and open source pioneer, Brian Behlendorf, now leads the effort to build the infrastructure for trust as a service. In the past, he helped build the foundations of the web with the Apache Foundation and brought open source to the enterprise. Now, please join me in welcoming Brian Behlendorf, Executive Director at Hyperledger, ex-CTO at World Economic Forum, and moderator Bart Bob, President of BSCF 2018.
All right, hey guys. I know it's been a long day for all of you, but thank you for staying. And I promise you, the last one is always, well, not necessarily the best, but very, very good one of all of our speakers. Brian is the Executive Director of Hyperledger, backed by Linux Foundation, that builds infrastructure for trust as a service. And one of the interesting things is that he is also a Cal grad a few years ago. Well, that's underestimation, but when he was still at Cal, he did computer science and physics together. Let's see what he has to say for us. I'm sorry. Could you please provide a bit overview of your past experiences and what led you join Hyperledger?
And I hate to correct you so early on in the talk, but I actually didn't graduate. Now let me tell a bit about the backstory and kind of the arc that I went on. And hopefully this is useful and not just kind of wallowing in nostalgia, so bear with me for a bit. But started here at Berkeley in 1991, thinking physics, because that was the science that it seemed the least about rote memorization to me, the most about kind of cognitively like how the world fit together. But after 3 semesters of that, kind of just got lost in the plot, just endless math proofs and that sort of thing. And meanwhile, found myself getting addicted to this really cool new thing called the internet. And in 1991, this was right when Tim Berners-Lee had released his first browser and server, but by that point, people were still really talking about email and Usenet and FTP and Gopher and IRC and things that hopefully, or maybe some of you have heard of, but we're all kind of like the sticks and stones and prehistoric kind of tools of early days internet. But what intrigued me was like, where did this stuff come from? What did this just get delivered by a company one day or an enterprising grad student who kind of like hacked it out and like, ta-da, it's the internet? No, it was actually a network of researchers, some of them at universities, some of them at research organizations, some of them working for companies like Cisco or Sun Microsystems or other companies that are long since gone, but all working collaboratively to share not just here's what we should build, here's some specifications to build it, and by the way, here's some source code to demonstrate that it's a good idea, right? In fact, Berkeley was kind of ground zero for a lot of this in something called BSD Unix. It was like one of the first operating systems that were kind of like Linux, right? But it was collaboratively built too, as kind of the antidote to the version of Unix that AT&T was building. So got really excited about this, started attending computer science classes and switched my major, but also found myself kind of getting bored. And around the same time, I was doing a number of different things. I was really into music, right? Really into electronic music, dance music, and being a Cal freshman or whatever, couldn't get into the 21 and over clubs in San Francisco, but could find the cool beach parties where somebody drags the sound system out and a couple of DJs show up and you start playing music and they don't charge any fee, and that was kind of fun, right? These full moon massive parties and that sort of thing. So got into that scene and started connecting the internet to that crowd and using email to like send out notifications for where the cool parties are, or having conversations about which DJ was better than someone else, or like, hey, you know, there should be free water at raves, that sort of thing. And that kind of grew into a mailing list, grew into a website, grew into this kind of like social network, but long before there were social networks, whatever. And then somebody at Wired magazine, who I had known, Wired had just started, they just published their first issue, said, why don't you come in and hang out with us and teach us about how this internet thing works? So I said, okay, and started crossing the Bay Bridge initially once a week, and then 3 times a week and then 7 times a week, you know, working there kind of as a underpaid, not unpaid, but underpaid kind of employee, getting them online. And in the course of putting back issues of the magazine online, we also started to play with unique content. We started to play with, well, how do we get this to pay for itself, right? Are we going to charge people money to be able to access this thing called a website that no one even really knows what a website is, and you can't do anything securely anyways, right? You can't take credit cards on the net at that time. Or do we just do it simply and put ad banners on things? And that seemed kind of hokey and cheap and like weird, but like, okay, why not? So I have the dubious distinction of having put the first ad banner online. I'm sorry. I've been apologizing for it ever since. But it was kind of fun. And what drove all of this was this like sense of fun, this sense of what's the next interesting thing we could do. And both San Francisco and the Bay Area and the internet were these highly generative places at the time, a place where you felt like you could try ideas. If you failed, if they were a bad idea, that's okay, just get back up and do something else. The one piece of advice that I guess my parents gave me you know, and I went off to college was find a parade and get in front of it. And this felt like a parade. This felt like something that had momentum. And even if I was going to make a lot of mistakes, that it'd be worth diving in and doing. So working at Wired, going to school, trying to go to school here, kind of skipping one class, skipping the next class, kind of, you know, but I was learning things that were 20 years old, it felt like, and building things that were brand new. And so the cognitive dissonance kind of eventually got to me, and I just started to spend all my time across the bay. And I've been back, in fact, the last attempt I had here at Berkeley to try to put together, like to make it work, was to put together a major that combined internet with like social studies in some way to like, hey, there's going to be this thing called virtual communities, and we should try that out. And couldn't find any faculty sponsor for that double major, so oh well. Then like 3 years later, they launched the College of Library Science, or whatever they call it here, right? So was the first online engineer for Wired magazine and what became Hotwired. At the same time, I was founding another company that built these novel website things, total brochureware, like dumb things, but starting to do that for companies like Volvo or ClubMed or Saturn Cars or Nike or Levi's or Harley Davidson. Then that eventually grew kind of big. And then I moved to that full time and left behind Wired, left behind Cal, and committed to that for a couple years. And in the course of doing that, I was CTO there, which meant we recruited a small engineering team, but mostly it was myself and a bunch of other people hacking up interesting websites. And in the course of doing that, we were using, remember, all the software on the web had been built for free by researchers, right? And the web browsers and the web servers, this was before Netscape, before the Netscape Navigator browser. This was all stuff that had come for free. And so when we were using this stuff and we found a bug, we would report the bug. And usually because we had to be self-sufficient, when we found a bug, because we had the source code, we could fix it. And we'd offer not only here's a bug, and by the way, here's how to fix it, right? And just like this Rave mailing list and these other kind of online communities, an online community formed around this web server platform that was started by some students at the University of Illinois. They all left and got jobs at Netscape when Netscape got started. And so the group of people around them who were using this web server package and sending improvements and such, you know, when the students sent them an email going, guys, we're not going to do any more releases of this web server because we've all been hired away. The rest of us went, well, that's nice for you, but we're going to keep going if you don't mind. And that was the start of the Apache project. And so that was 95-ish when we spun that out. Within 3 years, that was 65% of the web was running on the open source piece of software, which we didn't really want to commercialize or sell because I was having too much fun at Wired Magazine, at Organic Online, which is this website design company I mentioned, doing all these other projects. I didn't want to like sell enterprise web server software. That seemed totally boring, right? But we just wanted to give this away for free because the idea of people like fixing our bugs for us and being able to tap into like people who knew what they were doing rather than amateurs like us was really exciting. So that was the start of the Apache project, the Apache web server project. And a couple of years into that, I kind of got the next kind of entrepreneurial idea. In those two other companies, I'd always like partnered with somebody. I had a friend who worked at Wired, he pulled me in, and he really served as a mentor, Jonathan Stoyer. And then I got pulled into Organic by another kind of mentor, another guy named Jonathan Nelson. And by this point I was like, all right, I think I've got the hang of this, how to get something started. So started a company called CollabNet. That was focused on taking how open source communities work and how they build code and putting that into like a platform, essentially one of the first software as a service providers that other companies could adopt and use to build open source software publicly or software that they collaborate with each other. Raised a bunch of money just before the crash in 2000, so I thought I was really super clever, right? You know, got the checks in just before the NASDAQ crashed. There's a long story to tell that we don't have time for, but basically put 8 years of my life into a company that flatlined and then bailed out, and at the end of that had nothing to show for it. And that's the reality. That's like something that can happen to entrepreneurs. Now, I made out okay with Organic, so like I had enough, right? And that was enough to be able to have the freedom to what I wanted to work on. Not enough to go and invest in, you know, Facebook when they got started, or Google when I got started, or anything like that. But enough. And I think we don't talk about that word enough. In some ways, having that has enabled me to work on the things that I wanted to work on. And after getting and I'll try to wrap up, after getting kind of like exhausted by putting 8 years into CollabNet, which was fun, which felt important, I got a lot of interesting things and kind of laid the groundwork for, and did a lot of education for companies that came later, like Atlassian and GitHub. In some ways, it was kind of GitHub like 3 generations too early. But then I kind of did a pivot, and I was like, you know, I'm done with this rat race in a little bit. I needed inspiration. I saw a politician, and obviously in 2005 and 6 and 7, if you're, you know, 2 brain cells, you're as politically active as you are today around these issues, because there's a guy in office as president then who was pissing everybody off. And so I was watching MSNBC, watching all the kind of like content, and then finally in 2007 saw a politician running for president for the 2008 nomination for the 2008 campaign, who started to say some smart things about the way that tech could be applied to deeper structural issues inside government and inside the connection between government and citizens and all that. And it started to be pretty inspiring. So through some connections, discovered I had friends working on the Obama campaign. So started to informally advise them, and still as an unpaid kind of volunteer, worked on kind of the tech policy kind of side of the campaign. And then when he got into office, went and served in the White House for a year in the Office of Science and Tech Policy. At a time when, you know, he had just come into office, when there was like, you know, the birthers were going crazy, there was no budget to do anything. Oh, and myself and, again, a colleague, a person who I came in with, Beth Novak, who was appointed the deputy CTO for the White House, we were chartered with implementing Obama's first executive order, the Open Government Directive. But without a budget, without a mandate, with stuff that, you know, how do you take comments into the White House digitally in a way that can't be spammed or can't be attacked, right? All these kind of deep, intractable things. So stuck it out actually for 2 years in DC doing that, and then some healthcare stuff. And decided that the commute between here and DC was getting too long. And really this was my home. So started taking on a contracting job, and then eventually a full-time gig at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. So moved to Geneva for 2 years, worked there as CTO, and really tried to get, and after spending 2 years in DC, seeing how like technology could actually improve how government worked, improve that connection, I mean, seeing glimmers of that at least, felt like there was a need to be able to do that in that organization as well. Lots to talk about there if you're interested. Spent half my time trying to get digital thinking inside their initiatives, and the other half getting them off of Lotus Notes. Which I guess everyone here is too young to have heard of Lotus Notes, so be thankful for that. So put 2 years in there, I had a lot of fun. The World Economic Forum puts on events like Davos, where 30 plus world leaders will show up and talk about how do we improve the state of the world. And it sounds hokey. It sounds like corporations paying somebody for, to pay off their guilt or something like that. But I've seen a lot of really cool stuff come out of those processes. So after 2 years of that, came back to the Bay Area. Actually, I'd always kept my place here, always kept my heart here, really. In fact, literally, because my wife, Kate, was born in Berkeley, lived here, and she was keeping the house here in San Francisco while I was off gallivanting. Came home, decided I wanted to get back into entrepreneurship a bit, so I went to go work at a VC firm for a few years, and then this thing called the Hyperledger project, the Linux Foundation, popped up, and I'll tell that story next.
Yeah, wow, that's a long story of your past experience. Yeah, that's very good. I guess it also told us a lot about how internet started from an open source project to something that people can actually do business on. And after that, you also talk about Netscape, when Mark and Jason was still an entrepreneur back then. I guess the audience also wants to know more about, like, what is the entrepreneurship initiative that you're taking now? How has your role in Hyperledger evolved over time?
Sure. So to talk about Hyperledger, I want to talk first about the Linux Foundation, because it's actually a project embedded inside the Linux Foundation. And the LF is a consortium. They've been around for about 15 years. They, kind of came out of this random kind of Brownian motion of activity of open source software development and said, no, in order for enterprises to trust it, in order for a car company to put Linux inside its automobiles or what have you, there has to be like an organization kind of serving at that center point that they can trust, right? That can say, no, there's some real science and rigor to how this code is being built. All of the legal T's and C's are being covered. In many ways, it's similar to what the Apache Software Foundation was set up to do as well, but a little bit more kind of corporate collaboration focused. And so the LF has been doing this for about 15 years, putting together these communities of companies and the developers who work for those companies, but also developers beyond that set, around software technology initiatives. Initially, the Linux operating system, the Linux kernel, but increasingly in these other domains like cloud computing, software-defined networking, telcos, et cetera, and then blockchain technology. And in 2015, when the Hyperledger project was announced, it was a time when, I'm sure none of you are so young you don't remember then, but blockchain technology was starting to explode, Bitcoin was starting to explode, the Ethereum ICO was about to get started, that sort of thing. And everybody was really excited about the prospect of kind of trying to take this trend that had happened in the cloud computing world of everything seeming like it's coalescing onto 3 or so parties out there and re-decentralizing the internet, right? And it's certainly something I was worried about too, where were we going to end up with like you having the choice of maybe 3 or 4 different places to run your code or to build your business, and ultimately you'd expect to have to sell out to one of those 3 or 4 if you were successful, right? Because they would just come in and be able to eat up all the rent and charge you, whatever you would bear in order to live in their universe, right? So I was really eager to see the internet decentralized, but I was super skeptical about Bitcoin in particular. This idea of burning CPU power to run a lottery to see who gets to put the next entry into a ledger was like crazy to me. As was this idea of a speculative financial instrument being the next TCP/IP packet, right? It felt like kind of contrary to how I felt like the world should be built in a way. But then I started to realize there were these use cases for distributed ledgers for blockchain systems to help address things that at first glance might seem like they're not needed, but really, again, spending time in DC and Geneva and these other places was like, no, there's a real problem here. And that's, who owns the truth, right? Who owns the system of account, the system of record to say what your bank balance is, what property you own, what diplomas you've received, right? Your birth certificate. Like, these aren't just entries in somebody's database somewhere where if they get hacked or if they have a change of heart or decide they don't want you to exist, then they can disappear that, right? These are all things that you possess. These are documents you possess. This is data that you possess. And the internet wasn't built that way. The internet was built very much in a client-server mode where the client is dumb and the server has all the data. So anyway, so the Linux Foundation launches this thing called Hyperledger in December 2015. And at first I was super skeptical of this too, right? Because it was companies like IBM and Intel and JP Morgan and Fujitsu and these other kind of like big companies saying, we're gonna jump into the blockchain space too, kind of like latecomers or kind of like 45-year-olds like me showing up at a skateboard park, you know, and saying, hey kids, hold my beer and watch this. And instead, what I found was that it was a project designed to solve those kinds of use cases I mentioned. Use cases in everything from banking to supply chains to digital identity, all these things, but without having those two things that really worried me about the blockchain space to date. And so I saw that, I saw some friends of mine involved in it, I saw the thinking was really solid, and it's a totally open source project, so anybody can get involved in it. And I said, how do I help? And they hadn't yet hired somebody to kind of lead that project, so I jumped in and took that on. And you know, projects like that, like when you have enough commercial support, when you have the right kind of direction, you don't have to take a vow of poverty to work at. Like, I don't have like massive stock options kind of waiting for me when we go IPO or anything like that. There's no ICO happening or anything like that. But like, again, that concept of enough, right? Like, I live pretty comfortably here in the Bay Area. I have a wife and a 4-year-old daughter, and I'm able to support like what we're doing, working for a nonprofit in the tech space. And the fact that I could do that and still have what I felt was like a positive impact and work with a community to build tech that would solve some business problems, but I think solve some other kind of intractable problems was like really important to me.
Awesome. Seems like internet and technology, there are a lot of ways of application that can really help us to make an impact. It's not just on business, sometimes it's also on nonprofit or even governments. A lot of speakers since these 2 days have talked that their success are usually paved by some achievements or failures along the way. Would you mind talk about your favorite failure to us?
Favorite failures. Well, I mean, in some ways, like starting this company, CollabNet, in '99, and having that be like the thing that I put all of my good ideas into, and seeing it take off on a rocket ship, and then for for some very good reasons and some not so good reasons, it kind of flatlining, and then getting to the point where it's like, all right, it's time to bail on that, was like a slow motion crash in a way, right? But I learned some big things from that, right? And first off, I'd certainly encourage anybody who's thinking about doing a startup, like find people who you can work with, right? Who've done it before, who that you can learn from, and then think about starting something and being the senior person there. But even if you are the CEO, even if you are founder number one, find other people to learn from, and find ways to challenge your own assumptions about things, and find ways to constantly ask yourself, are we doing the right thing? Because what I think would happen with CollabNet is our first 2 customers were HP and Sun, who hired us to do these really big, massive projects. But what we found was that they dominated our revenue for like the first 4 or 5 years. So we designed our products to meet their needs rather than the needs of the broader market, right? So we had product market fit. Like, we had things that got VCs excited because they saw 50% growth a year, that sort of thing initially. But there's only so many companies like that. And when Atlassian came in and said, oh, we've got this thing that designed for like teams of 5 or 10, and you can use a credit card to get started really quickly, that was something that was really hard for us to pivot to. So that is my favorite failure, I guess. It's always an awkward question. But the one that, I think I would hope could serve as like a lesson for me for the next kind of things I do, is just constantly be challenging your own assumptions about things.
Awesome. Doesn't that sound like a typical failure though? Okay, since the time is running out, what is your 1 or 2 advice that you would like to give us, either on life or career, for our typical audience of students or young professionals who are passionate about tech entrepreneurship? Usually in their mid-20s, aspiring, want to have a super high dream to approach you.
I wish I could put it concisely, but I'm really encouraged now by the fact that among so many people in the tech industry, there is this real focus on values and social impact and wanting to build a better kind of Silicon Valley than people of my generation or the generation before us have ended up building. Like, right now the internet kind of sucks. I mean, it's led to a lot of just really pathetic outcomes, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about kind of the increase in wealth disparity, you're talking about all sorts of different things that the internet has not been the solution to, that I think many of us who were idealists at the very beginning were hoping that it would be. That battle isn't won and lost at the level of protocols or technologies. It's won at the level of companies going out and building things with two kinds of impact. One is make yourself sustainable, of course, find an interesting return for your investors, make yourselves as entrepreneurs and your employees whole, and get to that point of like financial safety. But don't forget about like all the other kinds of positive impacts you could have with your tool if it's any good, right? Give it away for free to nonprofits. Think about contributing back upstream to open source projects. Think about how do you empower people as well, rather than hook them on your product, right? If more of the tech industry that's getting started this year, if more of you did that, I'd feel a lot better about where we're heading than I think we've been in the last 10 years.
All right, that's definitely true. I can't agree more. Let's give a warm applause to Brian, and thank you guys for coming.